as we look at what's gone on since World War II, the U.S. has also levered up as a country, continued to increase that, and with an aging population. So the desires to do something, of course, are a clear one. What do they do? What can they do? Where do you try to get more revenue? Where do you try to cut costs? Is obviously a difficult multivariable equation. One of the things that I draw a little bit of hope from that you mentioned is a potential for a more peaceful world, which is interesting in a world where there are a lot of real wars and real challenges going on, not just noise and threats of them, as you referenced within Israel, Hamas, of course, Ukraine, Russia. And in a corporate sense, it's interesting that often for companies to quit what I'll call squabbling over little things, they often have to get into a level of distress that people say, okay, it's time to put my little challenges aside, and we got to all rally together and focus on solving this. So maybe there's some hope there from a global perspective that people say, look, there's real challenges. We've got to quit all this small fighting because it's going to cause a lot bigger problems. How can we come up with a more harmonious way of working together? Is that part of a potential thought there, or what gives you a bit of hope? Because I'm sure many people are quite concerned with everything happening around the world, not just the threats of it, but what gives you hope for a potential more peaceful world?
Well, I mean, it's a tricky question. I would say that the thing they're describing is very important. The risk of that is a collective action problem, to put in game theory. In other words, how do you get different countries to collaborate? So I think that there is, again, the idea of doing it with globalization. The costs to that are fundamentally too high. Even if you think about US-China full decoupling, that would be a significant shock. I mean, you can say we're close, we're in a trade war. I think there is a tendency to roll these back and to sort of moderate, and that comes from the Trump administration, comes from other governments. We're in this far now where tariffs and the reciprocal tariffs are being negotiated. There's a lot of risk. I tend to think there is possible to reach some sort of modus vivendi. But again, it's going to be very risk fraught. It depends not only on the policy choice, but execution. So what I show with this matrix, and I'm not going to go into detail of it, but basically Trump administration has a choice. The reformist approach will revive globalization. You make it work for the American, let's say the American worker, the American small corporation, for the things that the people want, the people that voted for Trump. Or you take a revolutionary approach and you do away with the existing Bretton Woods post-1945 structures. Now, there's another component to that, is execution. Is execution flawless or competent, or is it flawed? So depending on how you look at this kind of 2x2, you can end up with 4 matrices. I would say that for now, and this can be changed, Trump is still aiming, the Trump administration, to have a newer world order, is trying to go back to the 80s or 90s, to have, even if you think about the Mar-a-Lago talk, which has gone down, but this idea of having a more sort of US-friendly world order with a maybe weaker US currency, with some protectionism or some manufacturing returns. Of course, more decoupling with China because that's a strategic rival, but a cold peace. And again, the US sort of booming or having this sort of optimism like I had in the 1990s. They're aiming for that. And I think that's the thing you're describing. That's the optimistic scenario. No, just because they're aiming for that doesn't mean they're going to get there. If you look at the way diplomacy is conducted, it's sort of this kind of jarring, chaotic approach even to tariffs. It's very easy to end in one of the other scenarios, some of them which are less, I would say, market and economic friendly and more geopolitical dangerous, frankly, than the other. So the most likely sort of mirror image of what I'm describing and sort of the bad scenario would be a crumbling status quo, where you have trade wars. Again, you have alliances and trade deals with the US that are drifting apart. They're not completing, breaking apart. High US-China tensions, kind of economic model through, think of the 70s, right? When US power was kind of on the low, there was some deglobalization, inefficient reindustrialization. You can think even of subsidies and tariffs sort of creating, I would say, inefficient companies. So the other two is, again, if you move to the revolutionary side of the picture, it's kind of, if the Trump administration decides to sort of move away from NATO, cut deals with China, Europe, and Russia, and create sort of like a 19th century great power concert that then rules the world. The US becomes a regional power in the Americas and partly in Asia, and you have sphere of influence, which can become peaceful, tense, but that actually leads to slower and selective globalization, really regionalization. Of course, if that's not properly executed, and I don't think the Trump administration wants to go to that, although that's on the table. Again, if you try to do that and you execute poorly, you end up with the 1930s. I mean, to use a different analogy, so you end up with a breakdown in the West, with the US actually retreating into the United States. At that point, the dollar as a dominant currency, I think, is also imperiled. I don't think it's otherwise. Intensifying trade wars, more heavily rearmament. And that's, I would say, the worst case scenario that can come out of this. Now, this will play out over a few years. These things don't move instantly. It could even play out over a longer period of time when Trump is no longer president, over 4 years. But it's kind of a way to sort of think about it heuristically about where could we end up. And of course, this is a spectrum like with most scenarios.